Good evening. I am Agustin Arteaga, the Eugene McDermott Director, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the annual Mitchell L. Rosenberg Lecture. It is really great to see you all here back in person in our auditorium. And it's been quite a while since we have done programming with people sitting there where you are. So I want to thank you for being here tonight. And for those who are tuning in from home, I also thank you for joining us. Before I invite Dr. Nicole Meyers to introduce tonight's esteemed speaker, I'd like to take a moment to express our profound gratitude to the three trustees of the Michael L. Rosenberg Foundation, Larry Barsoon, Debo Gage, and Bob Harrison, who are sitting here with us this evening. It is really an extraordinary thing that you do for the museum to steward that marvelous collection that is the cornerstone of our European galleries. You've done something fabulous for this city, for everyone that visits, and we will never have enough opportunities to say thank you. At the heart of our celebration of this incredible collection of the 18th century French paintings and decorative arts and a long-term loan from the Rosenberg Foundation that are featured beautifully in the Europeans' art galleries is the purpose of presenting every year a lecture. And this is also something extremely significant because not only you are contributing with sharing the extraordinary works of art, but providing an opportunity for us to have new scholarship and to learn about what we love most, art. Larry, Debo, and Bob, the DMA and the community we serve are deeply grateful for the Foundation's continued generosity. And again, this is your home. Thank you all for being here. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicole Myers, Interim Chief Curator, and the Barbara Thomas Lemon, Senior Curator of European Art, to the podium to introduce tonight's speaker. Nikki, thank you.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to echo Augustine in saying how it's truly wonderful to be together with you here, both in person and online, for this year's Michael L. Rosenberg Lecture. I'd also like to join Augustine in thanking the Rosenberg Foundation. As he said, we're really indebted to your gratitude and your sustained support over the years. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker this evening, Dr. Jessica Fripp, who's Associate Professor of Art History and Undergraduate and Graduate Chair at Texas Christian University, where she teaches European art from 1700 to 1945. Prior to joining TCU in 2015, she was a postdoctoral fellow in material and visual culture at Parsons School of Design in New York. Jessica completed her master's degree in art history at Williams College and her doctorate at the University of Michigan with a dissertation on portraits of artists and the social commerce of friendship in 18th century France. A specialist of 18th century French visual culture, she has published widely in her field, contributing numerous scholarly essays and articles to edited volumes and journals on topics ranging from artistic patronage and cultural salons to depictions of aging and portraiture. Jessica was a contributing author and editor of a book published by Marc et Martin in 2016 titled Artistes, Savants et Amateurs, which explores art and sociability between 715 and 1815. Jessica's most recent book, Portraiture and Friendship in Enlightenment France, Studies in 17th and 18th Century Art and Culture, was just published last year by the University of Delaware Press. This fresh and insightful publication is available in the DMA's bookstore, and Jessica will be signing copies this evening immediately following tonight's program. Tonight, Jessica will be delivering a lecture titled The French Academy in Rome, Adventures in Bromance, a cheeky reference to the importance of professional networks and friendships to artists struggling to achieve success in 18th century France and beyond. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming her to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening, and I would also like to thank the Michael L. Rosenberg Foundation trustees, as well as the DMA and Nikki and Augustine for having me tonight here to be the Rosenberg annual lecture. And I also have to say it is great to be back in person. This is my first general public talk since, before the pandemic, and it is really, really wonderful to be back up here. So this talk, in some ways, is a sequel to the wonderful talk by Dr. Mark Ledbury last year, which took as its starting point the DMA's painting by Jacques-Louis David, Apollo and Diana Attacking the Children of Niobe, which addressed, among other issues in history painting, the Grand Prize or Prix de Rome competition. This was, as you may know if you remember from last year, one of David's unsuccessful entries into the competition, which I show here next to the painting that won, by Anicet Charles-Gabriel Lemonnier. And my talk addresses tonight many of the same artists that were included in Dr. Ledbury's talks, but very different types of works. And I don't expect you to remember all the names from last year. If you didn't attend the talk, that's perfectly fine, you'll still understand this. But in 1778, the French history painter Joseph Benoit Suvet returned to Paris after his 6-year stay in Rome as a pensioner of the Royal Academy. During his voyage home, he wrote to Lemonnier, who was still in Rome, quote, "I would be too happy if everyone could be convinced of the sincerity of the feelings they have inspired in me. Goodbye, my dear friend. I embrace you with all my heart, and I am your friend for life," end quote. Suvet would not be the only pensioner who wrote back to Rome and felt the need to pass on his warm greetings to the men there. In 1774, the architect Pierre-Adrien Paris asked his fellow architect Jean-Jacques Huvet to send, quote, "1,000 regards from me to all my friends, especially Vincent, Bouteau, Suvet, Foucault, and Rousseau, and don't forget Barthélemy." The reference to friends in these letters begs the question, what did it mean to be friends in the 18th century, especially as artists? Numerous artist biographies and catalogue raisonné mention the individuals with whom artists interacted with as their friends in passing, but what it meant for artists to be friends is rarely considered. This is the central question of my book, Portraiture and Friendship in Enlightenment France. In the first edition of the Dictionary of the Académie Française, published in 1694, the word ami, or friend, was simply defined as, quote, "a mutual reciprocal affection between two persons more or less equal," end quote. But friendship was a hot and hotly debated topic during the Enlightenment, discussed in such famous works as Michel de Montaigne's On Friendship, Madame de Lambert's Treatise on Friendship, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile. The substantial scholarship on friendship in history and literature, which covers everything from legal documents to personal correspondence to novels, has demonstrated the word friend was as malleable then as it is today. So just think, for example, of the fact that when you connect with anybody on Facebook, they insist that you are their friend, right? Enlightenment understandings of friendship were driven by broader changes in society, growing secularism, the rise of merchant capitalism, and new sites of voluntary association, including coffee houses, literary society, and Masonic lodges. Artists were not immune to these changes in and participated in these new spaces of sociability that were redefining friendship. To give just one example, scholars of the history of collecting and patronage have examined the idea of friendship to fruitfully consider the role of new conceptions of friendship played in patronage circles. Charlotte Guichard has demonstrated that friendship was central to the rise of the amateur, a new type of patron collector that developed in the 18th century, as it disguised interested, unequal relationships as disinterested egalitarian ones, and furthermore, that the word friend was employed consciously and purposefully. And I am showing you here one of those examples of those sociable spaces, the country house of Pierre Crozat, who was a notable patron, collector, and treasurer to Louis XIV, because it is so beautifully represented in the Rosenberg's collection in this painting by Nicolas Lancret. The point of my book is not to claim that certain artists were true friends while others were not. Instead, my starting point is how the variable definitions of friendship was used along portraiture. Portraits are a particularly useful genre for analyzing relationships. They serve on one level as documents of social interactions, helping us to reconstruct the milieu in which artists circulated. But these encounters, both friendly and professional, are only one part of the story. Portraits can teach us not only about their subjects, but also about the social currency of their display and exchange. I consider a range of portraits to be the primary documentary evidence of friendship, but with the understanding that the word friend was as a self-conscious construction of the social interactions in the 18th century as the portraits that supposedly represented them. The creation, display, and exchange of friendship portraits under examination in my book implicated a diversity of artistic milieu, from celebrated artists working in minor genres, such as the engraver Charles-Nicolas Cochin, to women artists such as Adelaide Lebiguiard, to history painters such as François-André Vincent. And importantly, a number of the artists that I cover in my book are well represented in the Rosenberg collection, including Lebiguiard, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and François-André Vincent. One of my major interests is how easily portraits could move between public and private spaces. Not all the works of art addressed in my book were intended, from their inception, to have a public life. Certainly, some of the portraits were destined for the Academy's biennial exhibition from the start. Others moved from more intimate viewing spaces, such as the homes of artists or patrons, to the walls of the Louvre Salon Carré well after they were created. Finally, a number of portraits never circulated beyond the original group of men who were depicted in them. My focus tonight is the latter. Portraits which did not reach a wide audience and are the most unusual of my case studies in terms of format. Caricature portraits created by artists in Rome. Among French artists, François-André Vincent was perhaps the most prolific in the genre, creating over 100 caricatures during his time in Rome, and would continue to create caricatures throughout his career. The Musée Carnavalet in Paris and the Musée Atget in Montpellier holds a critical mass of his most impressive examples of the work in this genre, which seem to have a serial quality. At the Musée Carnavalet, a series of medallion portraits, including the painter Barthélemy, the sculptor Sénéchal, the painter Ménageot, the painter Labouteau, the sculptor Moite, a self-portrait by Vincent, the painter Suvet, the architect Paris, the sculptor Milot, the sculptor Julien, and, in a slightly different format, the sculptor Stuff. At the Musée Atget, fully worked up full-length portraits include César Van Loo, Milot, Delastre, the architect Rousseau, two images of Suvet, the architect Renard, Bouquet, the painter Jean Bert, Lemonnier, the painter Canavas, the architect Rousseau, and a lone straggler image that's in the Municipal Library in Rouen of Labouteau. Other examples of Vincent's caricatures seem to be more like doodles or one-off images. And Vincent was not the only artist to create caricatures. Jean-Simon Barthélemy represented Vincent in a state of surprise shortly after their departure to Rome, or slightly before their departure to Rome, and the French sculptor Jean-Baptiste Stuff produced a series of caricature drawings that were etched by an amateur named Maurico Franconville in a total of 7 plates, and I'm only just showing you one example here. Caricature wasn't limited to French artists. The Swedish sculptor Johann Tobias Sergel, who socialized with French artists and appeared in their caricatures, created humorous drawings of the Swiss painter Henri Fuseli, the Danish painter Nicolas Abraham Abigard, too many languages in one sentence, among others. It makes sense that these men would want to represent each other and create souvenirs of their time. A stay in Rome was the capstone of any aspiring artist's training, as it offered an unparalleled opportunity to study the works by Renaissance and Baroque masters, as well as the antiquities in the ancient city and its environs. It was also not a trip every artist could take. Artists usually relied on state support, a generous patron, or occasionally personal wealth. But why choose caricature? And I love these drawings precisely because of this question. The format speaks to the friendship expressed in the quotes I used at the beginning of this talk, yet they are also deeply enigmatic, inside jokes which we will probably never quite understand. So in order to at least suggest an answer to this question, I'll be focusing on 3 topics: caricatures' Italian roots, the particular context of life as a young artist in Rome, and finally, caricatures' relationship to both drawing pedagogy and sociability. Caricature has a long history in Italy. The word itself comes from the Italian caricare, to charge or to load, and its origins are often traced to Leonardo da Vinci's physiognomic studies, often referred to as grotesques, which were copied and circulated in England and France immediately after his death in 1519. Yet Italian artists did not practice the genre professionally until the 18th century. Pier Leone Ghezzi is often described as the first example of an Italian artist who turned the art of caricature into a business, making caricatures of Jacobite emigres, artists and connoisseurs, both Italian and French or foreign, musicians and opera singers, and, most importantly here, foreign visitors, particularly wealthy men participating on what is known as the Grand Tour. For wealthy individuals, the Grand Tour, or a trip through Italy, was a finishing school of sorts, providing an education in classical art and culture. Participating in the tour also had the potential to open up doors in society upon one's return, best exemplified by English clubs such as the Society of Dilettanti that restricted membership to men who had traveled to Italy. Ghezzi's caricatures became a popular alternative to the other common form of portraiture commissioned by travelers, the Grand Tour portrait. The works of Pompeo Bottoni, one of the most sought-after Italian portraitists in Rome, is a prime example of the type of portrait that became associated with the tour. For example, his portrait of Sir Gregory Page-Turner from around 1768 depicts the wealthy landowner and future member of Parliament at 3/4 length. Sir Gregory is a dashing, energetic figure who looks at something just outside the frame of the canvas, gesturing as if in conversation. Known for his extravagant and fashionable dress, he is depicted in an appropriately luxurious red suit trimmed in gold. He is surrounded by objects that speak to the knowledge he has gained on the tour: books, an inkwell and pen, a map of Rome, and a bust of Minerva watching over him. The background of the painting opens onto a view of the Colosseum. And even Sir Gregory's pose makes reference to classical antiquity. It was adapted from the Apollo Belvedere, one of the most famous statues in the Vatican, and one which the artist reused in a number of Grand Tour portraits. Bottoni's portrait of Turner is carefully constructed to represent his participation in the Grand Tour and highlight his personal wealth and education. And just for comparison, I have also up there an unidentified sitter who is probably a French man that is at the Metropolitan Museum. Ghezzi's drawings were less time-consuming, cheaper, more portable, humorous but not cruel, and also an important souvenir when traveling through Rome. They also spoke sometimes to what tourists did in Italy that wasn't related to erudition. As historian Jeremy Black has noted, much of the correspondence written by tourists and their bear leaders, which was the name of the men who were hired to guide men through Italy, such as Dr. James Hay here, this correspondence was concerned with debts, gambling, and shopping more than with historical and cultural sites. So the humorous alternative of caricature, while popular, was not always appreciated by those who funded the trip. Madame de Pompadour responded to receiving a caricature of her brother, the future Marquis de Marigny, with the words, quote, "I will tell you that I found your caricature dreadful. The king thought the same, and no one recognized you, not one of your people. I have little interest in this talent. And it is worth noting that Madame de Pompadour's brother had been sent to Rome for 2 years in preparation to become the arts administrator of Louis XV, a role he took on in 1751. So I think one can understand why she was a little annoyed to get an image like this when he was supposed to be there learning basically how to do his new job. With the broader context of caricature established, let me return to our French students. Much like the tourist caricatures were a form of demonstrating in a humorous or less stuffy way the privilege of visiting Rome, Vincent's caricatures speak to the particularities of an artist's time in the city. As I already mentioned, traveling to Rome was a privileged experience and deeply rooted in artistic education. Studying in Rome was considered so important that in 1664, only 16 years after the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in France was founded, the Academy created the Grand Prize, which we usually refer to as the Prix de Rome today. A 3 to 4 or sometimes longer funded trip to Rome for the institution's most promising young history, painters and sculptors, and eventually architects. In Rome, artists copied works of art for the crown, made their own studies of paintings, antique and Renaissance sculptures, drew architecture, landscape, and also continued their studies in life drawing. And I'm just showing here a handful of examples of some of the products that came out of this stay by a variety of artists. It was also an important place of socializing and networking for all artists, not just the French ones. The Palazzo Mancini, the home of the Royal Academy or the French Academy from 1737 until 1793, was a popular place for wealthy tourists to visit, allowing the pensioners to forge important patronage networks. The life drawing studio at the French Academy was open to foreign artists visiting Rome, not just the French ones. And in 1775, Joseph Marie Vienne, then the director of the Academy in Rome, noted, quote, "I am always preaching and giving advice. The Palais Mancini is full of artists, both French and foreign," end quote. Beginning in 1754, Pope Benedict XIV offered a free drawing school, and many foreign artists joined the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, their main painting academy. By the last half of the century, numerous officially sponsored, that is to say national foreign academies were created, and foreign artists such as the sculptor Johann Tobias Sergel and the Swiss sculptor Alexander Trippel founded their own private drawing schools in Rome, adding even more opportunities for young artists to work and interact with each other. Outside of these academic contexts, French, British, Swedish, Danish, and German artists not attached to officially sponsored academies lived together in the area around the Spanish Steps, not too far from the Palais Mancini on the Via del Corso. And artists with or without official sponsorship socialized at neighborhood cafes and trattorias, such as the Cafe Greco, the Cafe Inglese, and the Trattatoria Roster, as well as traveled in groups to villas outside of Rome, such as the Villa Madama, and to further field to Naples, Tivoli, and Herculaneum. So, much like college students today who study abroad, there was more to life in Rome than just academics. The quotes by Suvet and Paris that I began with point us towards this other equally important aspect, friendship and socializing. We get a sense of the French pensioners' extracurricular activities from the journal that the architect Paris kept during most of his stay. He mentions late-night games of trick-track or backgammon with Vincent, as well as concerts, plays, excursions, and dinners. In an incredibly detailed entry for November 20th, 1772, he describes a visit to the catacombs with a group of men, including Vincent. And there's an ink wash drawing by Vincent from this period that depicts such a scene. I don't know if it's exactly this one, but it's quite intriguing that it very kind of matches up with the story that Paris talks about, further suggesting that the daily adventures of pensioners in Rome could be inspiration for artistic practice, both in Rome and well after their stay. And one should look at the work of somebody like Hubert Robert, who continually comes back to his images of Rome throughout his career. Importantly, Rome was a city populated by an unusually large amount of men compared to the number of women, thanks to visiting male artists, wealthy men on the Grand Tour, and the clergy around the Vatican. The social and gendered context offered what historians and cultural anthropologist William M. Reddy has called an emotional refuge, which allowed men to create relationships that were based not on kinship or rank, even if on a temporary basis, and fostered camaraderie and close relationships that were central to the formation of masculine identity. Now, as I've worked on these caricatures, the word that has always come to mind is bromance, a contemporary portmanteau of the word bro and romance. And Merriam-Webster, yes, it is in the dictionary, defines it as a close non-sexual friendship between men. And you are probably familiar with the concept, as it could be applied to a number of beloved male duos in popular culture: Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, or more recently, Ted Lasso and Coach Beard. Caricatures were particularly well suited to recording the bromance shared by artists in Rome. The practice of caricature by Vincent and his fellow French pensioners had specific connections to their artists, to their lives as student artists. For example, drawing from the live model was fundamental to the Academy's pedagogical program from its founding in 1648 until its dissolution in 1793. Before arriving in Rome, the pensioners had proved their talents in numerous academic competitions, such as the Prix de Quartier, a prize that distributed 3 times a year for the best drawings after live models, known as Académie. And drawing from the live model was also a key part of the curriculum at the Academy in Rome. The practice was included among the instructional activities listed in the founding statutes of 1666, although how strictly the practice was maintained seemed to have varied by director. Charles Natoire, the director of the period under consideration here, is credited with reinforcing pedagogical practices that had fallen by the wayside. But by the end of his 23-year career as director, he seems to have stopped doing so, and the early 1770s coincided with a period during which this program, including the daily practice of life drawing, appears to have been somewhat neglected, and he would eventually be forced to step down from this role in 1775, much to his dismay. Another emphasis in artistic training was the study of expression. Students participated in an annual competition known as the Prix Caylus, in which they were required to create a large-scale drawing of a head, or a tête d'expression, enacting a particular emotion. The chosen emotion, as Melissa Percival has discussed, was typically a mild passion, such as compassion or contentment, because according to the prize's founder, the Comte Caylus, such subtle expressions were unusually difficult for artists to capture and required close study of the live model. These passions, Caylus claimed, were best conveyed by a woman's face, and so the model for the concours, or competition, therefore, was typically female, and I'm showing you an example of that on the right. Barthélemy and Vincent's interest in caricature is intriguing in that the two performed very well in the competitions that focused on perfecting drawing from the live model. Both Barthélemy and Vincent won second-place medals for the life drawing in the Prix de Quartier in 1763, and Vincent won the Prix de Caylus in 1767. Given the pensioners' success in academic life drawing competitions, the cohort's use of the charged portrait or caricature can be read as a form of bravado, playful send-ups of the very practices expected of student artists, which they had mastered. In the case of Barthélemy's drawing of Vincent here on the left, it's created in sanguine and white chalk, the traditional artistic media used in the expression studies. But instead of capturing it in this sort of accurate way, it's exaggerated, and he's also taking this sort of expressive, dramatic passion here of shock. I always like to imagine that they've just played a practical joke on him, and they're like capturing the response to what happened here. So we're kind of inversing this calm practice of the tête d'expression, and instead creating this violent or terrible passion expressed by a man. The impressive group of black chalk drawings by Sant at the Musée Atget, which depict his fellow pensioners in full length, are a twist on the practice of life drawing that was central to academic pedagogy. Sant's series, again in the same sort of black chalk media that was used in their official student works, his shading gives volume to the figures, which are carefully rendered, folds and wrinkles in the sitters' costumes, which included detailed buttons, buckles, and wigs. Sant portrayed his fellow pensioners from behind or in profile, and the diverse poses and points of view resemble those that were created during life drawing sessions, where a professor posed the model and the distribution of students around the room guaranteed a mix of perspectives. In the two images of Sauvé, Sant slightly shifts the weight of his sitter. In one drawing, he appears to step forward, allowing Sant to accentuate the bend of his torso, and the use of foreshortening suggests that the figure is tipping forward. In the other, Sauvé seems more anchored, balanced on both feet, with a casual contrapposto curve that is highlighted by the seam of his coat. These images of Sant's companions from behind have a striking resemblance to life drawings, and I'm showing you here one by Sant that we know through a copy by a later artist, Demarteau. That the figures are clothed might seem to distance these drawings from the close study of human anatomy and musculature that we associate with studying the nude. Yet Sant used the clothed bodies precisely as a means through which to caricature his sitters. He exaggerates their bizarre anatomies through their costume and accessories, such as this drawing of Lemonnier, whose short vest both frames and calls attention to his Callipygian figure. These drawings also reference the day-to-day sociable activities of artists, such as this series of drawings created by Stuff that were engraved by Franconville. The figures are arranged in pairs and threesomes in a variety of activities. And again, there are about 7 or 8 sheets of these, but for space, I could only get 3 of here that you could read them because they're quite tiny. In the first sheet, an unidentified figure lunges towards a man named Uwe, who stands with his arms raised and a walking stick above his head. He lifts one leg off the ground as if engaged in a kind of bizarre dance. On the right half of the same sheet, Sant and Paris are shown in conversation, separated from the first 2 figures by an inexplicably placed cat. Sant gesticulates wildly, his eyes open and mouth gaping, in some ways kind of familiar to that Barthélemy caricature I just showed you. Paris leans towards Sant, awkwardly thrusting his bottom out behind him. The architect extends his right arm towards Sant, and his figures are spread open. On the top right sheet here, Sergel takes a pinch of snuff from a figure labeled Rigaud. On the lower sheet, Louis-Simon Boiseau, holding a drawing portfolio, examines a Roman bust of a bearded man. He is joined by Simon-Louis Bouquet, who leans into the artwork to examine it with a looking glass. And next to them, an unidentified figure regards with condemnation a man who sings and plays a violin. On the right side of that sheet, Sauvé, who we've seen, turns away from the viewer, his foot raised as if he was disappearing into the unidentified space behind him, and again shown in from the back like we've seen him shown by Sant. Le Buteau lunges towards Sauvé, grabbing his hand as if in an urgent manner, as if to stop him from leaving. And we see similar themes in some of Sant's works that are kind of more the one-off versions of these images. Jambert playing the violin, Uwe on the right taking snuff. These drawings are silly and exaggerated, but they demonstrate many of the pastimes common to artists in Rome. And in recording the activities and the individuals who participated in them, the caricatures become a kind of expression of or memento of their sociability. Such a social use of portraiture mimicked the kind of quick artistic practices that were developed in spaces of more refined sociability back in France. Carmontel, for example, represented members of the circle of Louis-Philippe Joseph, the Duc d'Orléans, in gouache and watercolor portraits. Quickly done and not widely circulated, these works frequently show individuals in genre-like scenes of conversation, musical performance, or game playing, as seen in the examples here of a game of trick-track and a musical performance. Charles-Nicolas Cauchin likewise represented the circle of illustrious men and women who participated in the Salonière Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin's gatherings through a series of medallion portraits which remained in the Salonière's collection. Their creation was described by the curator of prints for the King's Library in the following way. Quote, Cauchin drew many of the amateurs and artists who were received and very well hosted every Monday. Madame Geoffrin held at her place a dinner called the Dinner of the Arts, and while they conversed, Cauchin amused himself by drawing either his colleagues or the amateurs with the intention of having them all engraved to make a suite of portraits, and they were engraved and eventually shown at the Royal Academy's exhibitions. Vincent's medallion portraits in particular mimic the systematic form of Cauchin's works, but they explode the engraver's formats. About 5 times the size of these delicate medallions, and the medallions are very small, they're about 10 centimeters across. They eschew neutral expressions for scowls and slack jaws. In the portrait of Suvet, the artist seems to peer out at the viewer with a sideways glance, a mischievous grin fixed upon his face. Such an expression adds an element of interaction completely absent from Cauchin's serious yet informal works. And although Cauchin's drawings were described as a form of amusement during Geoffrin's salon, they have a thoughtful tenor to them, appropriate to the careful balance of play and politesse that governed Geoffrin's and other 18th century salons. Sites of Parisian sociabilities were still governed by the rules of polite conversation and proper behavior that were enforced, for example, by somebody like Geoffrin. And the aristocratic circle of Carmontel would have similarly expected a certain level of decorum. In contrast, the unserious nature of the caricatures implies that life in Rome was defined by the escape from such constraints. The sociability of artists was founded in a different type of relationship than the sociability experienced by artists integrated into these sociable spaces. Understanding the humor of the drawings and recognizing the individuals by their physical features was made possible by the conditions of close and sustained contact, living, working, eating, and socializing together. Each individual has a charged aspect of anatomy or costume, which becomes a leitmotif across all of Vincent's portraits and those of his colleagues. His portraits of Le Buteau, both in the quick sketch and parodic life drawing, as well as the medallion drawings, focus on the artist's prominent nose and unshaven chin. Rosenberg is usually depicted wearing a very silly, tall cotton hat and is identified by his long, lanky figure. The repetition of a particular nose, unshaven chin, or distinctive hat suggests that the humorous passages in these works, whether overt or subtle, operated as inside jokes. The closeness of these men is also demonstrated by these caricatures. They are often shown in various states of disarray. Rosenberg, for example, wears disheveled and ill-fitting clothing, and careful shading allows the viewer to see the outline of the artist's shoulder blades and his musculature, making it appear as if his coat is too small for his large frame and his slippers too small for his feet. His oversized hat, sometimes paired with a set of spectacles, suggests encounters in the more intimate spaces of the artist's studios and lodgings, rather than the more formal social activities that took place in Rome, such as dinners or musical performances. The architect Pierre Rousseau is likewise shown in a kind of informal dress with a nightcap and a kind of banyan or a man's robe. And Bouquet proudly appears with beady, bespectacled eyes, fish lips, and a large tear in his partially undone pants. So, what happened to these drawings after these artists left Rome? Well, they were reproduced and exchanged amongst the men. Perhaps the strongest evidence that these are more than just silly drawings. The series in Musée Atget and other caricatures by Vincent exist as counterproofs, that is, copies of drawings made by placing a damp blank sheet of paper over an original and running it through a press, leaving a reverse image on the blank sheet. Other original sources for these counterproofs occasionally survive. The large caricature of Jean Bert is a case in point. The original is located in the Met Museum in New York, although it has lost its feet, and the Louvre has the full version. And this is a very large one. It's over about 3 feet tall, so it's and requires several pieces of paper to have been hinged together. A drawing of the history painter Suvet, also at the Met, is the source of the counterproof drawing for his image in the Musée Atget. The Atget counterproofs, as well as a portrait by Barthélemy, may have come from Vincent's collection, since the catalogue of his posthumous sale in 1816 lists 33 pieces of different subjects and caricatures under the section Suite of Drawings on Individual Sheets, Sketches, Studies, Figure Studies After Nature, and Antique Objects, Expression Studies, etc., by the deceased Monsieur Vincent. Towards the end of his life, Vincent annotated these portraits with names and dates, and these inscriptions correspond almost exactly to the name of artists listed in the student registry by the Royal Academy. Thus, these portraits must have operated as a sort of group portrait of all the men who resided at the Palais at that moment. The provenance history of some of the caricatures made by Vincent and other pensioners revealed that they were gifted or exchanged among the artists. Vincent's portrait of Suvet and a profile portrait of Jean Bert at the Met can be traced back to the history painter Lemonnier, as can several caricatures of Lemonnier now in private collections. Franconville's engravings ended up, one version of them ended up in the collection of Sergel in Sweden, who annotated them himself with all the names of the individuals. References to caricatures and portraits also appeared in the estate sales of many pensioners after their deaths in the 19th century, though they are less specific. So Suvet's collection, for example, which went up for sale in 1807, included 9 counterproofed caricatures by Vincent, as well as other counterproofs of figure studies and sketches by Lebouteau, Barthélemy, and Ménageot. And the art historian Jean-Pierre Cousin, who wrote the catalogue raisonné of on François-André Vincent, has also traced several now lost caricatures to other collections of these men. Later, Barthélemy's nephew, Charles-Nicolas Duchange, was struck by the frequency with which Vincent, Barthélemy, and Ménageot brought up their time in Rome later in life. Quote, "How many times have I seen them, old and all 3 of them together, like in Rome in their studies, or more often at a joyous dinner, bouts of laughter at stories of their 1,000 follies and even their loves," end quotes. He also mentions in his biography of his uncle how Vincent and Barthélemy either made remarkable portraits of each other or charges sparkling with verve and spirit. He described, quote, "a charming caricature by Vincent in the family's collection, drawn in pen and sepia, in which Vincent exaggerated in the most amusing manner the great height and thinness of his friend." Duchamp also recalled seeing in Barthélemy's studio another charge, also by Vincent, the pendant of that one, end quote. So, through their reproduction by counterproofing and etching, and subsequent circulation among the other pensioners, the caricatures functioned as meaningful souvenirs of the bromance the artists shared as students, even if it was fleeting. So not all of these men maintained the same level of camaraderie even after returning to Paris, and some of them, of course, went to other countries. But particularly in Paris, they would be thrust into the internal politics of the Royal Academy and eventually the French Revolution. Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions, if anyone has any for Dr. Fripp.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I know that a lot of your work is based around these circles of friendship, and I really enjoyed learning more about this one in the Free to Roam context.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could share any other examples of specific contexts or groups that you find particularly interesting or kind of charming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the other chapters is very much, well, actually, two of the other chapters are very much focused more on images that end up being shown in the Royal Academy Salon and kind of tracing out those circles, and in particularly looks at the concept of celebrity and how those artists could use celebrity or also the celebrity of their patrons in order to kind of create more of a stir at a salon, and how celebrity could be used to sort of mask those sort of patron-artist relationships. This chapter is quite interesting because it acts very much in the opposite direction, or very much as a foil as many of the other things that I talk about in the book, which is really much more about the public presentation of friendship. And this is, in some ways, as I mentioned, one of my favorites because they leave a lot to the imagination in terms of why are they really doing these. Obviously, these are my ideas about them, but you kind of wonder what they were really doing in the Palais Mancini, hanging out. Amy?
Thank you so much. This is really, really convincing. It's so convincing that I assume that the answer to the question I'm about to ask is no. But I was wondering if Vincent and any of the other caricaturists in this circle are turning their pencils on women at all. Obviously, it's a very male circle, but is caricature itself in this context really just purely masculine?
For the French pensioners, as best as I can tell, yes. Sergio and some of those Nordic guys, actually, I didn't include them because they actually get quite obscene. And I wanted to keep this somewhat PG for the audience at home. But there's definitely, I mean, there's one of an artist. I'm also not as familiar with these Nordic artists as I am the French fellows, but there's one of a man named Brunlik, I think is his name, like literally falling on top of his model. You know, there are others. There's a woman falling off a horse and her dress is flipping up over her face. So those get very kind of misogynistic in many ways, and so they didn't make it into this talk tonight.
But it sounds like even the caricatures that are of women, they're about reinforcing a sort of male world.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely. And in fact, when you read the sort of stories, especially of the grand tourists, and I mean, the main way that they're encountering women is basically through prostitution, is really what it is. So,
thank you.
You're welcome. So I did get some of my dirty stuff in here.
Thank you so much. Following up with Amy's question, I have a question about the gendering of these images as well. You mentioned that, of course, the landscape of Rome was very masculine, but I'm wondering if in Paris or any of the other geographical locations you were studying, if there are similar networks of women artists producing images of each other and what those look like in comparison to these.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, my chapter that is mostly focused on Vigée Lebrun and Le Biguillard talks about the way that they're representing men. You certainly get somebody like Le Biguillard who does images of her female students. Interestingly, you don't have a whole lot of the men who sort of reciprocate and paint the women, at least that we know of. I always dream that somewhere out there these images are in, you know, somebody's collection or in the storage of a museum somewhere. But, you know, that being said, you know, the idea that the Royal Academy in Paris and the Louvre is some sort of, you know, male homosocial thing is absolutely not a reality, as, you know, Melissa Hyde has shown and a number of other feminist art historians, right? They're married to wives who are artists. They have sisters who are artists. They have daughters who have artists. So, you know, that is a much more mixed gender community, even though that's probably not what the Royal Academy wanted us to think or wanted people to think at that time.
Great, thank you.
Again, hello. Again, thank you so much for coming in. This is great. Going back to the bromance topic, I'm really curious as to if there was any inspiration in any artwork done in the topic of bromance by these guys that has any roots in bromances of antiquity. The one that I'm thinking of in particular is Damon and Pythias. If there's anything kind of rooted in that throwback, if you will, to antiquity of like bromance, brotherhood values.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the whole sort of larger framework for the book is how in the 18th century people are sort of coming to terms with the fact that that classical ideal of friendship that everyone uses in the early modern period is really not the only version of it. So I focus on specifically things like disinterestedness, inequality, and masculinity, and look at how kind of these portraits and Enlightenment philosophies are really sort of starting to break those assumptions down. So absolutely, this idea that bromance goes back to ancient Greece and Rome is 100% correct. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So we have time for one last question, I think, back here.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, did you also look at the continuation of these caricatures, or do they stop? Or I know that, for example, I look into Picasso, and Picasso did that a lot when he was younger, especially also in the context of his travels. So, yeah, did you notice that there is a continuation, or did that stop at a moment? These caricatures.
Well, Van Sant certainly continues doing them when he's back in Paris. The most sort of serial ones, similar to kind of these guys, is he does ones of the members of the Institute after the French Revolution, which in some ways, when you look at them, look like he's, it's like being bored in a faculty meeting and you just start drawing everybody around you. But he does, and Sergio also, I mean, if you go through his graphic work, he's somebody who's always doing these sort of very strange drawings that maybe we're not also going to understand. And the practice really picks up in the 19th century, and which is something that I know some art historians have been working on in terms of satire of, graphic satire of artists in the 19th century.
So we want to thank Dr. Jessica Fripp again for this wonderful talk, and a reminder that her book is for sale in our store, and she'll be signing books immediately following this presentation. So please give her a great applause for this presentation.
Thank you so much.